Hello everyone, I hope you all are doing well. My name is Ankit Jain. I welcome you all to my channel Take Journey with Ankit. Based on the multiple requests that I am getting on my YouTube channel and also on the Telegram, many of you are looking for a detailed playlist on the Apex Trigger. So from today I am decided to get started with the Apex Trigger Bootcamp. In this bootcamp, basically we will be going first into the deep theory of the Apex Triggers, and eventually we will try to cover as much scenarios as we can. Most of the scenarios that I am planning to cover in this series that are again frequently getting asked in the interviews as well. So I hope this series will help you not only to get the deep dive knowledge of the Apex triggers, but also get you prepared for your interviews as well. So without further delay, we can get started with the Apex triggers now. So in case you folks like to connect with me for one-to-one connect, you can definitely connect with me on the top mat where you can access also the LWC notes and the admin notes that also I have. Moreover, you can also connect me on the Telegram. In case you guys do have any questions or any queries, you can definitely join this Telegram group as well. So for today, what we will be doing here in the Apex trigger here is we will try to understand a end-to-end theory. What is Apex triggers? What all the best cases you should go for the Apex trigger? What all the different good practices that you should be following in the Apex triggers? What is context variable? When to use what kind of context variable? That's what we will try to understand one after the other. So let's get started with the very basic. What is actually the Apex trigger? Again, in Salesforce, we do have many automation tools. Many of you have already used a few of the automation tools like the validation rules or the flows. As we already have this many automation tool, why actually we do have a need of an Apex? Again, many of the complex scenarios which is very challenging to get solved either by using the validation rules or the flows. But if you want to perform the automation, you can definitely go for the Apex triggers. So whenever you folks are getting any business requirement and you have to evaluate whether that requirement can be met by using the automations or by using the programmatic approach, Salesforce always recommend to go for the uh, point and click tools rather than writing down the Apex triggers. But in case requirement is very complex, you have to deal with the huge amount of data, then definitely Apex triggers is the solution. So in a nutshell, what is actually the Apex trigger? So a quick definition of the Apex trigger here is Apex trigger is something with the help of which you can perform any custom action. If you have a piece of code that should be executed before or after your record is getting saved, then you will go for the Apex triggers. So Apex triggers, it will enable the developers to perform the custom action before or after, because there are two times the Apex trigger will execute. I will talk more about it down the line to the Salesforce record. Again, Apex triggers will be helpful to perform the custom action whenever you are either inserting the record, updating the record, deleting the record. Moreover, you are undeleting the record from the recycle bin as well. So Apex trigger is a piece of code that will execute as a user if you are performing this many different types of DML operations. As I said, you should be using the triggers only and only when if your requirement cannot met using the point and click tools like the validation rules or the flow. For example, if you have a requirement that you have to validate whether uh, if you have to go and validate whether the email address is blank or not, or if you have to go and perform a very easy customization, then you can definitely go for the automation tools like the validation rules or flow. But however, the requirement is very complex, right? Which you think that over the line or over the time it will get more complex, then definitely Apex trigger is the best solution to go for. Use Apex triggers if the performance and the scale is important. If your logic is too complex for the point and click tool, moreover, if it is a more CPU intensive operations, then only you should be going for the Apex triggers here. I hope this part is clear what is Apex triggers. As a developer, how you will make the decision when to go for the automation tools and when to go for the triggers. Now there are two types of triggers which are available. First is the before trigger and second one is the after trigger. And as a developer, it is very, very important that you should be understanding whenever you are writing down the trigger, whether you should go for the before trigger or you should go for the after trigger. If you guys do have a familiarity of the order of execution diagram, you guys might already know that in one single transaction, there are two times one trigger is getting called. Again, I am repeating, if you guys do have a basic clarity of the order of execution, you guys already know that one trigger, it is getting called twice. So basically, whenever the user is performing any operation, what will happen here is first your before trigger will execute. After that, your record will be saved. Again, here I am saving only the record will be saved, not committed. And then the Salesforce will execute the after trigger. Now, as I said, it is important for the developers to understand when to go for the before trigger and after trigger, because based on the business logic, you have to make the decision what particular type of trigger that you will be using. Now, Salesforce have provided few guidelines when to go for the before trigger and when to go for the after trigger. You should go for the before trigger typically whenever you have to update a record. For example, there's a one record due to which the trigger is getting invoked. And if you have to update the same record, then you have to go for the before trigger. Then you have to go for the before trigger. If you have to update the same record, then and then only you should go for the before trigger. For example, again, I am modifying the account. Let's say, okay, on modifying an account, what I am doing here is I am putting the annual revenue as 5 million. And my business do have a rule that whenever the annual revenue is 5 million, I should go and update the rating of account as hot. If I do have that kind of a rule, then definitely I should go for the before trigger, because what I am doing in this scenario, I am updating the field of the same record. Another example, for example, my business do have a rule that on the contact object, whenever the email is blank, what I should do here is I should go and populate the email field with default email address. So what I am doing again in this example, I am updating the field of the same record. Then in such scenarios, you should go for the before trigger. Another example of the before trigger and where you should go for the before trigger here is whenever you are to perform the validations. Now, why validation? Because most of the times there are many complex validations that you cannot meet using the validation rules. In such scenarios, you can again take the help of the before trigger. For example, let's say I want to write down the validation rule that if the user is trying to delete the account and that account do have any open opportunities, I should not be allowing the user to delete the particular account. Or I should give an validation error to the user that this accounts cannot be deleted. Can this requirement met using the validation rules? Again, the answer is no. Can this requirement met using the flows? Again, the answer is yes, because the flow have introduced the custom error. But in case there are many records that you have to process, it's a CPU intensive calculations, then in such scenarios also you can go for the apex trigger. So do remember that the two use cases when to go for the before trigger here is if you have to update the same record, that is the first, and if you have to perform the validations of the record, then you should go for the before trigger. Except that for all the other scenarios, you should go for the after trigger. Except that for all the other scenarios, you must go for the after trigger. So after trigger use case is basically whenever you have to access the system modified field. For example, you need to access the created date, which is generated by the system. If you need to access the ID of the record after the insertion, then again, it's a system generated field. If you need to access the system modified timestamp in your logic, again, these are the system generated fields. Whenever you need to access the field values that are set by the system, such as the record ID or the last modified date, then you should go for the after trigger. Moreover, if you have to perform the callouts, callouts means if you have to do the integrations from the trigger, again, you should be doing that in the after trigger. Another one here is if you have to perform the operations on the related records, then again, you should be doing that in the after trigger. So after trigger do have the more use cases as compared to the before trigger. Okay. I hope this part is clear. What is before trigger? What is after trigger? When the before trigger is getting invoked and when the after trigger is getting invoked. Again, I am repeating, this is very important. Your before trigger, it is getting invoked before your record is saved. Before your record is saved, and after trigger, it is getting invoked after the record has been saved. Now, This is the syntax of the trigger. So the syntax of the trigger goes something like this. You have to put the trigger followed by the trigger name. On, you will go and specify on what object you will be creating the trigger, and after that here you will be specifying the what all different events in which your trigger will be invoked. In what all different events your trigger will be invoked. So here if I am creating the trigger on the account, so let's say here I am giving the trigger as account trigger on account object and specifying here what all different events the trigger will be invoked. Similarly, you can go and create the trigger on the custom object as well. For example, employee trigger, it is my custom object, employee is my custom object. So here I will be creating the trigger on the employee, putting the events here. This is how you will be creating the trigger on the custom object as well. So I hope most of the part is clear. Trigger, it's a keyword. Trigger name, you can give any name. On is again a reserved keyword. As object, you can specify as object as the standard object or the custom object. Now coming to the next very important thing, that is the events. So what is events? So basically in Apex Trigger, we do have the 7 types of event. In Apex Triggers, we do have the 7 types of event, and remembering the name of the event is very simple. I will give you a trick how you can remember all those 7 types. As we just now discussed, we do have the 2 types of trigger. One is the before trigger. Another one here is the after trigger. These are the 2 types of triggers that we do have. Coming to the next part, we know that we can perform the different types of DML operations. What all the different types of DML operations that we do have? Insert, update, delete, and undelete. These are the different types of DML operations that we can perform. Now, you have to use these 2 information to go and create the 7 different types of event. So what is this information? So you have to use the trigger name followed by the DML operation. So my first event here will be the before insert. Second event here will be the before update. Third event here will be the before delete. Again, there is no such automation that you can do before you go and recover the recall from the recycle bin. So there is no event with the name of before undelete. Again, I am repeating, you cannot perform any automation before the record is getting recovered from the recycle bin. So there is no such event with the name of before undelete. Now, the next one that we do have here is the after insert, after update, after delete, and after undelete. After delete as well as after undelete. So these are the different types of events that we do have. So in total, we do have the 7 types of event. If you know this part, you can easily go and create these 7 types of event. Now, there are few things that you have to remember whenever you are specifying the event. The first point that Salesforce recommend, always specify those events which are logical for your business scenario. Although we do have the all 7 events here, but for example, on my object, there is no way user can go and delete the record. I'm not giving any of the user that flexibility to go and perform the delete operation. I should not be specifying the before delete and after delete. So the first point with related to the events here is whenever you are defining the triggers, always specify logical events. Out of the 7 events, whatever the events which are logical, you should only go and specify those events here. Although if you go and specify all the 7 events, it will give you any error. The answer is no. But again, as a part of best practice, you should only specify those events which are logical as per your business scenario. Second point. Again, here it does not matter in what sequence you are defining the trigger. For example, here if I go and put the before insert, comma, if I put the after update, it does not matter. Again, whenever you are specifying the events are separated by the comma. The next point here is it does not matter in whatever the sequence that you are specifying the event. You can specify the before insert, after update, after insert, after delete, after undelete. In whatever the sequence that you want to specify, you can go and specify it. But always define those events which are logical as per your use case. I hope this section is also clear to you what is the triggering event. Moving to the next point. Now there's one good thing that you need to remember. Again, it's a recommendation from the Salesforce that you should always be doing one trigger per object. You should not be defining the multiple triggers on one object. The best way to achieve this is by using the frameworks that Salesforce is offering. If you guys do have an idea about the Apex recipes, there are there is a very good detailed video on the Salesforce developers channel as well. I will put that link in the video description too on the Apex recipes, about the Apex recipes, how they are using the trigger framework. Again, the point that I want to highlight here is whenever you are writing down the trigger, you should be writing only one trigger per object. So all the automations that you have to do on the account object with the help of trigger, you should be doing it only in one trigger. All the automations that you have to do on the account object with the help of trigger, you should be doing it only in one trigger. Will the system give me the error if I do go and create the multiple triggers, something like this? For example, here, if I am creating the two triggers on the account object, do I get any error? Again, the answer is no. System will not give you any error whenever you are creating more than one triggers. However, the reason being you should go and create only one trigger per object. Two primarily. One is the maintenance of the triggers will be very easy because you have only one trigger to maintain. And the next point here is you can control the order of execution. If you do have more than one trigger, there is no guarantee from the Salesforce. Salesforce will execute which triggers first. So it's a recommendation that you should only go and create one trigger so that you can have the control of the order of execution. As I said, if you have more than one trigger on the object, you cannot control which trigger logic will execute first. Right? Again, the best practice, as I said, to use the one trigger per object, try to use the framework provided by the Salesforce. There are few other frameworks that people do follow. For example, they do use the interface framework. They do make sure that they are using the context variable wisely. Now, that brings me to the next point. What is context variable? Very important slide. You guys, if you are seeing this slide for the first time, do take a screenshot of this slide every time whenever you guys will be working on the triggers. So what is this context variable? Context variable is something which will define how the records can be accessed. To access the records that cause the trigger to fire. As we said that in one trigger, we should have written the complete logic for all the automations that we do have. So I need to go and write down the logic in my trigger for the insertion whenever the user is performing the insertion, updation, deletion. I need in one trigger, I need to perform the logic whenever my trigger is getting invoked as a part of before trigger. I need to go and write down the logic when my trigger is getting invoked as a part of after trigger as well. How I can make sure that my trigger logic is driven based on these many different scenarios. So what the Salesforce have done here is they come up with the concept of context variable. The very first context variable that we do have here is executing. What is this context variable? This context variable returns the value true. Again, do remember that folks, for all these context variable, you do not have to set any value. Salesforce framework will only set this value. Your job here is to check that value. So the first point here is for the first context variable is executing, it will be true if your Apex code is getting invoked by a trigger. Because one piece of Apex code can be invoked by a trigger, can be invoked by a VF page, can be invoked by a Lightning Web Component, can be invoked by an integration as well. So one piece of code can be invoked from many places. Now, if you want to write down the specific logic, whenever your piece of code it is getting called from the trigger, then you can go and use the specific context variable that is executing. It will be true automatically set by the system if the correct context of the Apex code is the trigger. Second one is insert. As I said here, we do have the different DML operation. So for each DML operation, what the Salesforce have done, they have provided this context variable. When we deep dive more into the example, you guys will understand the importance of this context variable. Okay, so whenever the end user, always the context variable value, I'm putting it here so that you guys can remember, always the context variables value. Here I'm talking about the insert, update, delete, and the undelete. is decided based on what operation end user is doing. Okay, so this context variable values will always be decided based on the operation what end user is doing. So for example, end user, let's say user A is creating the account. So what the user is doing here is user A is performing the insertion operation into the account. So in this scenario, the context variable is insert will be true and rest of them will be false. Rest of them will be false, right? Because the user is what the user is doing, user is creating the account, creation is same as the insertion. So the is insert will be true and the rest of them will be false. Another example, let's say user is deleting the account. This time what will happen is delete will be true. Is delete will be true. However, update, insert and undelete will be false. Based on the operation that user is performing, this particular context variable's value will be decided is insert, is update, is delete, as well as is undelete. Based on that, this context variable values will be decided. I hope this part is clear how these context variables values will be set. Now, there are two other context variable that we do have, that is the is before and the is after. Very important because there is some business logic that we already discussed here that needs to be executed in my before trigger. There is some business logic that needs to be executed as a part of my after trigger. Now, how I can make that logical classification in my Apex code, which piece of code needs to be executed in the before trigger and which piece of code needs to be executed in the after trigger? By using these two context variable, which will again return me the Boolean value. That is the is before and the is after. If your trigger is getting called in the part of before context, then the is before will be true. That means it will return true if the trigger was fired before the record is getting saved. Is after, it will be true if the trigger was fired after the record is getting saved. I hope this part is clear. All these context variable must be clear because all this context variable will always returns the values in the form of Boolean. Do remember that the return type of all these context variable will be the Boolean that is either true or false. Now coming to the next context variable, that is the new map, old and the old map. Again, what is this new and the old? New as well as old. If you guys have a basic knowledge of the flow, like in the flow, we do have the two context variable. One is the record and second one here is the record prior. It is exactly the same what we do have in the trigger as well. In the trigger also, we do have the new as well as the old. So best way to understand this example here is, for example, I do have one account. When the user is opening the account, the revenue available on the account here is 5 million. Okay, so when I am the user, I am navigating to that account. Let's say account is Take Journey with Ankit. This is my account. I am a user. I am navigating to this account. Current revenue of this account is 5 million. Now, what I have done, I clicked on the edit button and here I have updated the revenue as, let's say 10 million. I have updated the revenue as 10 million. So what the Salesforce will do, Salesforce will go and store the new value or the complete new record. Again, it is not storing the new value. It will store the complete new record into the trigger.new variable. So the trigger.new variable here, it does have the account with 10 million value. So whatever the latest value that user have put, it will be available in the trigger.new. Similarly, I do have other one, that is the trigger.old. In my trigger.old, what I do have here is the old value. As the name says, so here it will have account with 5 million value. So my trigger.new will have the new value and my trigger.old, it will have the old value. Right? So here we do get the 10 million as well as here we do have the 5 million complete record. Again, I'm not referring the single value here. It will have the complete record. Okay, now that moves me to the next point. So the data type of the trigger.new here is list. And the data type of trigger.old is also the list. So make sure that whenever you are writing down the triggers, it's not only about the triggers. Whenever you are working on the Apex, always make sure that you are taking care of the bulkification. Bulkification means whenever you are performing the operation, always make sure that your operation must be efficient whenever the user is processing the bulk number of records. It should not be basically hitting the governor limit. So what the Salesforce have done, these two variables here, they have defined the data type as list. Another key point here is trigger.new. This variable do have the values only when the user is performing the insert operation, update operation, as well as the delete operation. Sorry, update operation, insert operation, and the undelete operation. Similarly, my trigger.old, it will always have the value whenever the user is performing the update operation as well as the delete operation. So in my trigger.new, there will be no values. Basically, it will be null if the user is performing the delete operation. Because if you logically think, whenever you are performing the delete operation, right, you are not modifying anything, because we discussed that the trigger.new will be populated only when the user is doing the modification. Basically, whenever you are performing the delete operation, you are not modifying anything. So in such scenarios, it will be null. Trigger.old, it will be null whenever the user is performing the insert operation as well as the undelete operation. Again, here also, if you think logically, if I am creating something new record, there will be no old values, right? So it will be null, and same goes for the undelete as well, that it will be null whenever I am recovering the record from the recycle bin. This point is very, very important because many times people do get confused when to use the trigger.new and when to use the trigger.old, right? So I always prefer this kind of a table, so with the help of which you guys can easily remember, right? Trigger.new, trigger.old, and the different operation here is insert, update, delete, and undelete. Trigger.new do have the value for the insertion, yes. Do have the value for the update, again the answer is yes. Do have the value in the scene of delete, answer is no. In the case of undelete, again the answer is yes. Similarly, do we have the values for the in the trigger.old during the insertion? Again the answer is no. In the case of update, answer is yes. In the case of delete, answer is yes. And in the case of undelete, again the answer is no. Again, you do not have to remember this table. If you try thinking bit logically, you will automatically remember in this table. But again, if you are finding it hard, do take a note of this point as well, because in the coming examples that we will be doing, we again and again referring this particular table. I will make sure that you guys will remember this table if you are following this series till end. Now, so here we discussed about the trigger.new as well as the trigger.old. And here we do have the data type is the form of list. What the Salesforce have done, they have provided the two modified versions of the trigger.new and the trigger.old. And the two modified versions here is, like we do have the trigger.new, they have provided here the new map as well. And like we do have the trigger.old, here they have provided the trigger.old map as well. The difference here is, here it is of list type, here it is of map type. Here it is of map type. When we say map, we do know that map is always the combination of key and value. So here the key will always be the ID and my value will always be the new record. In the case of old, again, my key will be the ID and value will always be the old record. So here, again, if I take this example one more time, what will happen here if I go and need to use the trigger.new map? Trigger.new map. Here I will be having the map of account ID as my key, as well as the complete new record of the account. That is account with 10 million. Complete record, not single value. Okay. So here I am putting the new account record. Similarly, let me go and close this here. If here I am putting the trigger.old map, what I will have here, again, I do have a map, and here also I do have the account ID, and but here I do have the old value, that is old account record. This is the syntax of the trigger.old map. One key point that you have to remember, we discussed that in the case of new map, right, we do have the ID as well as the new record. So trigger.new map values will be available in all the scenarios like insert, update, and delete. It definitely the same rule will be applied here. Only the exception here is it will not be available if you are performing the before insert operation. Because again, if you logically think, before my record is getting inserted into the database, ID will not be available, right? So that is the exception here. Except the before insert, the values will be available in all the scenarios. Same goes for the trigger.old. In the case of trigger.old, values will be available in all the scenarios which are applicable for the trigger.old. I hope this will give you a clarity that when to go for the trigger.new and when to go for the trigger.old. Now, there are few things that I want you guys to take a note from this session. First one here is whenever you guys will be working on the before trigger, you should not perform any DML operation. No insert or update operation in my before trigger. No insert or update operation in my before triggers. Developers can modify the records in the before trigger, right, without explicitly calling a DML or insert or the update operation. So in case you have to go and modify the particular record, definitely you guys can do that. Like I have taken one example here. If I'm not wrong, let me scroll up. Mm, Okay, let me put down here. I'm not able to find out if the account annual revenue is 5 million. What I want to do, I want to do the automation to set the rating is equal to hot. Definitely, in the case of before trigger, you will be going to do that automation. However, in the before trigger, whenever you are doing that automation, you are modifying any particular field, you should not be writing update or insert operation. If you go and do that, you will get an error. The reason being, in before trigger, you should not be performing the insert or the update operation. The record is not saved yet. Your only job here is to populate the values. So when the record is getting saved at this stage, your changes will automatically be saved. You do not have to go and perform the DML operations again. Next point, trigger.new use cases. Trigger.new is a list of S object and can be iterated over in a for loop. As I said, trigger.new, it's a list type, right? Trigger.new is a list data type. As this is the list data type, you can definitely get it iterated over the loop like we are doing it here. If I have a trigger on the account record, trigger.new will have the list of account records, and we do all know that how to iterate over a list by using the for loop. Another very important use case, I have seen many times people do perform this kind of an iteration, get the account ID and then write down the SOQL query and again one more time. Don't do that. Basically, what you can do, you can directly use this trigger.new as a binding variable as well. You do not have to iterate over the records, get that stored into the collection variable, and then use that collection in the SOQL query. You don't have to perform all this additional overhead. The another use case of the trigger.new here is it can also be used as a binding variable like I am doing here. I do know that my trigger.new, it does have the account records. I can directly go and use in my condition where account ID in. I don't have to go and create a separate set, store the values into the set, and then I need to go and use that set. Whether that will work, again, the answer is yes, but you don't have to do the additional overhead. You can directly use the trigger.new in your SOQL query and get your job done. And the last point here is calling a class method from the trigger. As a part of best practice, you should not be writing down anything inside the trigger. Your trigger job is to only identify the context and then delegate rest of the jobs to the helper classes. Ideally, the way we say that the way your trigger should be written, it must be logicless. We should not write any business logic inside the trigger. If you guys do follow any trigger framework, does not matter. Follow the interface based framework, follow the trigger framework provided by the Salesforce. It's completely up to you. All the trigger frameworks implemented on the same logic that your trigger should always be logicless. The reason being, whatever the logic that you are writing down inside the trigger, like I have done here, which I labeled also as a bad practice, you cannot reuse the same logic again, right? Because the triggers logic cannot be called again if the logic is written inside the trigger. So what you should do, create a separate helper class, write down your business logic in that helper class, and then invoke your helper class from the trigger. So down the line, whatever the examples that we will be taking, we will be following this kind of a practice only, where we will make sure that my trigger should be logicless and complete complex logic. I'll be delegating it to the another trigger. So this is how, folks, your trigger will look like, right? Where the job of the trigger here is to identify the context. And once the context has been identified, it should go and delegate that business logic. So in this scenario, you guys can see that I am defining the logical events. I'm checking the context variable. In case you guys are not getting more glimpse about it, that's completely fine. Down the line, when we will be doing the example, again, I'm going to start with very basic examples before I move to the tougher part. Okay, so make sure that you guys will having the complete understanding. Don't worry if you guys are not getting it. But in case you guys already working on the trigger, right? Just a heads up, this is how you should be writing down the trigger. Try to define the logical context variables inside your trigger and make sure that based on the context variables, your trigger will be driven. Coming to the helper class, this is how your helper class written, and here you can go and perform the different automation. This is all I do have, folks, for this part. Now from the next part onwards, we will try to understand the few more things about the triggers, but with the more hands-on. As I said, I stick to the first part, the more with the theoretical, but this is very important to set the foundation before we go and actually deep dive into the multiple examples of the trigger. Again, I assure you, I will be taking as much example as I can so that you guys will feel confident if you are attending this bootcamp from start to end. Again, do share your thoughts in the comment section, what you found helpful in today's videos, what we should be improvising in the next videos. In case you do have any trigger scenarios that I should be covering in this bootcamp, again, do let me know in the comment section as well. Thank you, folks. Have a good time then. Bye bye.